Kewan, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
So you lead the Boston chapter of Open. That's where Open started.
Correct.
And we took the lead and we ran with it.
Correct.
But there are many similarities between the ecosystem here and Boston. Actually, Boston started, way before many activities happened in Silicon Valley. But somewhere along the way, Silicon Valley, like Open Chapter, ran.
Correct.
With all the innovation and entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
So, but wanted to touch you since you are taking care of the chapter there. What similarities do you see, and what differences are there?
Well, the similarities are that both places have excellent academic institutions, and there's a whole slew of youngsters that graduate every year from top institutions in both places. And the startup culture is pretty much the same in both cities. The places where I believe Boston is a bit different is a very powerful sense of research and academics which pervades the city. So if you see some of the, if you were to look at the top 10 technologies in the US every year, you will find that Boston has its hands in nearly 8 or 9 of them. Just between MIT and Harvard, they cover nearly pretty much 70-80% of the hottest technologies that are coming out of research. So one of the things that we are trying to focus on the Boston side of Open is to look at the strengths of the city and the particular culture. Obviously, in Silicon Valley, you have the culture of rapid scaling of the kind of enterprises that are web-based, social networking-based. But Boston has its hands in fundamental research coming out of top labs from MIT or Harvard and other schools like nanotechnology. So what I'm trying to encourage is to give a more diverse view of entrepreneurship based on those technologies, and how, for example, our technologies, which could be technologies from new batteries being made, nanotechnology coming out of institutions there, how is it commercialized? Boston also, if you know, has the largest private equity space. It's much larger than the private equity in anywhere else. So we're trying to tap into some of those connections, but typically our culture is more academic and more research based. So we are trying to bring in charter members from the private equity world, because those guys do the billion-dollar deals and they are not very visible to the eye.
So good education institutions, research institutions are important, a critical
Correct.
Element
Correct.
towards the first steps of entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
But it's a very different challenge to take research and technology coming out of an institution
Correct.
and then monetize it into a proper business model.
Correct. But
are there lessons that you think could be learned from Silicon Valley, or you think there are some lessons that could be drawn from the greater Boston area itself?
As I said, it's not as if Boston doesn't provide those avenues. There are some companies, for example, look at Facebook. It came out of Harvard, but Mark Zuckerberg thought that the Valley is the best place for that particular kind of technology to prosper. But there are other technologies, as I said, in the city which those people do not necessarily think of migrating, because they're tied into the research out of, let's say, MIT or Harvard so strongly that those are really the hotbeds of those technologies. So if you look at nanotechnology, for example, Northeastern, for example, has a brilliant nanotechnology center. The nanotechnology, the sensor technology coming out of that is being commercialized right there in Boston. So.
When you come to Open and empowering entrepreneurial ecosystem, like I said, it started there, it came here. Now you are leading it.
Correct.
So I wanted to learn from you, what are the nuts and bolts you're putting together to take it forward?
The Boston chapter for a few years had as the founders were aging, I think what we didn't do was to replenish the leadership. So one of my charters is to, actually I'm a bit older myself, I want youngsters to come in and bring the kind of flavor that the next generation of entrepreneurs, perhaps that is what we are lacking in the Boston chapter. And my charter is to bring and tie in those youngsters who are really coming up with and forming those startups in that area. So I think it'll probably take another few months, but we are, for example, we're holding a very elaborate event towards the end of May on Internet of Things. And the real thing that we want to do is to talk about some visionary stuff as opposed to just the marketing stuff. What are the fundamental visions of larger enterprises like Verizon or Cisco or the Draper Labs at MIT? What do they think of the dominant technologies in the. I mean, it's a buzzword right now, with a lot of players. But what are the larger players thinking? So that's the flavor of the Boston chapter. Will always, in the next few years, will be dominated by fundamental research, how it is commercialized, how the various institutions are playing its roles, how technology licensing, for example, works. MIT, as you know, is the largest technology license issuer in the US. So it's not as if technology is not being commercialized there.
Right. It's a pleasure, and thank you very much, and wishing you all the best.
Thank you.